The photograph was found inside a warped cedar chest, its hinges rusted shut by nearly a century of southern humidity. The trunk had been sealed beneath the floorboards of an abandoned house just outside of Clarksdale, Mississippi, a house the locals said no one had lived in since 1921. When the boards were pried open, a smell of mold and iron filled the air, and the light from a single window caught something pale beneath the dust. A portrait, blackened at the edges, yet eerily preserved at the center. A man stands in that portrait, tall and proud, his broad shoulders stiff in a formal suit. Beside him, not in front, not behind, but beside him, is a girl no older than 16. Her hand rests gently on his arm. Her gaze meets the camera with a defiance that feels unnatural for the time. Behind them, faintly blurred, a woman in a long dress watches from the doorway. Her face is obscured, not by age or damage, but as though someone had deliberately scratched it away. Pinned to the back of the photograph was a note in fading ink. Taken spring of 1915, the day she stopped being his daughter. No one could say who wrote it, but the name on the back of the frame, Harlan Whitfield, still echoes through the county records, buried in whispers of land disputes, sudden deaths, and the quiet dissolution of a family that had once owned half of Coahoma County's cotton fields. When the photograph surfaced, old residents of the nearby town of Leon began to talk again, about the patriarch who closed his church doors, about the wife who vanished, about the girl whose name was never written in any census that followed. They say the Whitfield house still stands at the edge of a dead cotton field, its windows boarded, its chimney split by vines. Sometimes, when the wind moves through the hollows, a faint piano can be heard, the same song the girl was said to play on the night. But her mother disappeared. But who was Harlan Whitfield? And what could drive a man, a father, a husband, to choose his daughter over his wife? Before the scandal, before the rot set in, the Whitfield name carried weight in Mississippi. Harlan's grandfather had come down from Virginia after the war, trading silver for scorched acres and building what he called a legacy of renewal. But by 1915 that legacy had begun to decay, both in the fields and in the bloodline. The Whitfield plantation, once lush with cotton, stood like a ghost amid the delta's slow-dying soil. The air was thick with humidity and regret. The cypress trees leaned inward as though listening. Locals said the land itself was cursed, that the cotton turned red one year, crimson as rust, crimson as sin, and that no crop had grown quite right since. Harlan Whitfield was the last true patriarch of the family. A man of scripture, pride, and control, he had inherited more than land. He had inherited a need to possess. Those who worked for him told stories of his temper, his sermons about purity, his insistence that his family remain untouched by the moral decline spreading through the Delta. He believed the outside world was diseased. He believed purity was found only in the blood that shared his name. His wife Eleanor was a quiet woman from Tennessee, educated, gentle, and according to a few surviving letters, terrified of her husband. She wrote of isolation, of strange sounds in the attic, and of the way Harlan would sometimes spend hours locked in the parlor with their daughter, Clara, teaching her scripture until long past midnight. The neighbors noticed changes first. Clara's schooling abruptly ended, her rare visits to town always under her father's watchful gaze. They said she began dressing like a grown woman, wearing her mother's jewelry, and her father's pride like armor. When Eleanor stopped appearing altogether, Harlan claimed she had taken ill and gone north to her family. But no letter ever came from her. No one Eva said or saw her again. Still the photograph, the one from that spring, tells its own truth. Harlan's hand on his daughter's shoulder, his wedding ring turned inward, a mother missing from the frame. And beneath that image lies the unspoken question that haunted Coahoma County for generations. Was the curse upon the land, or upon the man who claimed to own it? After Eleanor vanished, life around the Whitfield plantation began to unravel in ways that no preacher could explain and no neighbor dared to confront. The servants left first, not with loud farewells, but quietly, one by one, before sunrise. They said the nights had grown too heavy, that something unseen walked the halls after midnight, dragging its feet along the floorboards. By summer's end, only Harlan and Clara remained in the house. The piano could be heard almost every night now, soft at first, then frenzied, like fingers possessed by something restless. Those who lived near the property swore they saw the flicker of lamplight through the second-floor window, always in the same room, Eleanor's old bedroom. Rumors began to take shape in the church pews and general stores. Some said Harlan had found God again and was keeping his daughter close to preserve her virtue. Others whispered that virtue was the last thing left in that house. A young farmhand once claimed he had been called to deliver supplies to the Whitfields. He said Clara answered the door in her mother's nightgown, her neck marked by bruises shaped like fingers. He never returned. Then came the ledger. Found years later among courthouse records, the ledger listed names of hired help, harvest dates, and tithes. But near the back, written in Harlan's tight, elegant script, were notations that chilled historians. New Covenant, spring 1915. Beneath it, another line, written months later. Eleanor's line ended, Clara's begun. To outsiders, these words meant nothing, but to those who'd grown up hearing the old whispers, they carried the weight of sin and prophecy. The Whitfields were devout Baptists, yet Harlan's sermons had grown strange toward the end. Long, fevered rants about divine selection, about God's will being rooted in one's own seed. Parishioners remembered his eyes during Tebuyan Pashand. Ho's sermons, glassy, almost unblinking, and Clara sitting behind him, silent, expressionless. When the church finally locked its doors, the pastor claimed Harlan had asked to perform his own family baptism on the property. After that, no one saw him again in town. Only the faint echo of a piano drifting over the cotton fields reminded people the Whitfields were still alive. Or something close to it. In 1978, a storm tore through the delta, splitting old trees and unearthing forgotten bones of the past. When the Whitfield house partially collapsed, the new owner, a man hoping to restore it, found something lodged between two floorboards of the upstairs hallway. It was a letter, folded tightly, the paper yellowed and soft as ash. The handwriting was delicate, almost hesitant. At the bottom, the name was clear. Eleanor Whitfield. The letter had never been sent. Addressed to "My sister in Knoxville," it began as a plea for help. But as the words unraveled, the tone shifted from desperation to something that read like confession. Harlan says our daughter is chosen, that the Lord has shown him a way to preserve what was once pure. I hear them downstairs when I try to sleep, the prayers, the whispers. He tells me it is only faith, but I have seen her eyes when she looks at him. They are not a child's eyes anymore. Eleanor wrote of her fear, of waking to find Clara's bed empty and hearing laughter from the parlor. She spoke of hymns sung backwards, of scripture rewritten in Harlan's hand, and then came a single, chilling line. He says the mother must give way for the daughter to become whole. The rest of the page was smeared, the ink blurred by what might have been tears or blood. Investigators later confirmed that the letter had been written in April of 1915, the same month the family photograph was taken, the same month Eleanor disappeared. No official record of her death exists. No grave was ever found. But the floors of the Whitfield parlor told another story. Beneath a warped section of wood, stains had seeped into the joists, dark, circular, impossible to scrub away. When word of the letter spread, the county tried once more to have the house condemned. Yet every time demolition crews arrived, their equipment failed. Batteries drained, engines stuck. Lead. One man swore the piano began to play on its own when he entered the hall. A single, repetitive melody that made his hands shake for hours after. And carved into the piano's underside they found one final inscription, Clara's Covenant, 1915. For nearly a decade after her mother's disappearance, Clara Whitfield lived alone with her father on the decaying plantation. There are few official records of those years, only fragments, but sometimes silence says more than history ever could. The 1920 census lists Harlan as widowed, age 47, occupation minister. Beside his name appears only one dependent, Clara, age 22. Yet by then, those who'd once seen her described a woman far older than her years. Thin, pale, her eyes sunken as though sleep had abandoned her. When she did appear in town, it was always for provisions, never company. She carried cash but refused to speak, nodding once when addressed, her movements mechanical, rehearsed. In 1921, the Whitfield property transferred ownership for reasons never explained. The deed bore Harlan's signature dated March 3rd. A month later, he was gone. Some say he succumbed to illness. Others believe the earth took him, that his grave lies somewhere behind the house, near the pond where the cotton once grew thickest. Clara remained, alone. By that summer, neighbors claimed they could hear her singing in the fields long after dusk. The songs were old hymns but warped, lyrics twisted into something else. Children dared one another to approach the fence line, but they never crossed it. They said she watched from the window, her face half hidden behind lace curtains, waiting for someone, or something, to return. The local sheriff visited once in late autumn. His report, preserved in county archives, mentions signs of distress and strange carvings on the walls, circles intersected by crosses, numbers repeating in sevens. He described Clara as withdrawn but lucid, insisting she needed no help. "The Lord provides," she told him. "Father still walks these halls." After that she vanished too. The house stood empty again, silent except for the creak of settling beams and the rustle of vines reclaiming the porch. Yet those who passed by at night swore they saw two silhouettes in the upstairs window, one tall, one slender, and the faint glow of a lantern swinging gently back and forth, as if marking time. The Whitfield name faded from records after 1922, but the land and its silence remained. Time tried to bury the Whitfield story, but blood, as it often does, has a way of refusing the grave. In the 1950s, long after the plantation had turned to ruin, a local genealogist researching Delta family lines uncovered a puzzling entry in county birth records. It listed a child born in 1916. Father, Harlan Whitfield. Mother, unknown. The space for the child's name was simply marked C. The date aligned almost exactly 1 year after Eleanor's disappearance. The genealogist traced that single letter through decades of records, finding traces of descendants scattered across Mississippi, many with altered surnames, many living within a 50-mile radius of the old estate. What startled him most wasn't their number, but their resemblance. Photographs taken 40 years apart showed the same unmistakable eyes, pale, gray, and distant, framed by faces carrying the faintest echo of the Whitfield line. He published nothing. Instead, he left his findings in a sealed envelope at the Clarksdale Historical Society, labeled only, "Do not open unless the piano plays again." In the years that followed, strange reports began to circulate. Hunters claimed to hear music drifting through the swamp during fog-heavy mornings. Teenagers who trespassed at the ruins described whispers in the air, a man's low voice, and a woman's laughter overlapping like echoes out of sync. And then there were the photographs. In 1962, a tourist passing through took a picture of the decaying house at sunset. When developed, a second figure appeared in the doorway. Not a man, not quite a shadow. The outline of a young woman in a long dress, her hand resting on something unseen beside her. Some said the curse of the Whitfields was never just a story of sin, but a cycle, a loop of blood and possession that fed on secrecy. A covenant renewed with each generation that refused to name what it truly was. And so, even after the house was finally demolished in 1985, the ground beneath it refused peace. Construction workers unearthed bones, small, unmarked, wrapped in cloth, and a rusted locket bearing 2 initials carved inside, HW, but the second initial had been scratched out. When the cedar chest was finally opened, the same chest that hid the photograph, the letter, and the faint scent of long-dead lilies, the air in the room turned still. What lay inside wasn't treasure or relic, but a keepsake of obsession, a lock of auburn hair tied with faded ribbon, a small Bible warped by moisture, and that single photograph perfectly preserved between the pages of Psalms. The ink on the back had deepened over time, the words almost pulsing through the paper now. Taken spring of 1915, the day she stopped being his daughter. Some believe Clara herself placed it there before she vanished. Others think it was one of her descendants, someone who couldn't bear the burden of a name whispered only in shame. Whatever the truth, the Whitfield house is gone now. The field where it stood is nothing but weeds and wild vines, yet at night, locals say, the wind still carries a faint melody, a piano playing a slow hymn no one recognizes. The Clarksdale Historical Society eventually opened the genealogist's sealed envelope. Inside were photographs of living descendants, people who never knew their blood tied back to Harlan Whitfield. One woman, born in 1984, bore the same gray eyes, the same sharp jawline. She'd grown up just 30 miles from where the plantation once stood. In her interview, she admitted something she'd never told anyone. She'd inherited an antique piano from her grandmother. It arrived with a note attached, unsigned, that read, "This instrument was made for prayers that must never end." She said that sometimes when the house is quiet, the lowest key presses itself down, once, slowly, as if a single finger is still waiting to be acknowledged. Perhaps the Whitfield curse was never about the blood alone, but the silence that followed it, a silence that bound generations, trapping their sins beneath Scripture and Southern pride, and so the photograph remains, its faces staring out from another century, their secrets sealed in dust and devotion. But if the wind ever carries that melody again, if a single note trembles through the darkened fields of Mississippi, would you still believe it's just the sound of the past, or something still living, waiting to be remembered?